Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith, and welcome to Data Lit, a podcast for educators by educators. So we are wrapping up our 4th season of our Data Lit podcast. Can you imagine? It's been 4 seasons already.
Ooh, can't believe it.
Who would have thought we'd had 4 years worth of information to share with our listeners? I didn't see this coming.
Keep going.
So this season, we shared some learning around assessment and data literacy by interviewing our experts in the field. For example, we had Dr. Maxie Moore from DPI. And then we had one of our own accomplished teachers, Paul Cancellieri, who shared some information. Another format that we sort of kept is we also shared learning that you and I researched. So for example, I'm thinking of our street data episode where, we found a topic that was interesting, we delved into it, and then we shared that information with others. And then we also had, this was our second year of doing the Data Bites, where we sort of shared information about data that's happening in different departments within our district. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. So as we wrap up this year, I thought that we would sort of share some reflections of episodes or ideas that stayed with us or that was important to us or stood out for us to kind of share with our listeners, and then kind of talk about, what's coming for next year, season number 5.
Sounds good.
So the first one that I'm thinking of that really stood out to me was a clip from Getting Streetwise in the Classroom. So Spencer, can you play that for us?
One of the 10 equity-focused practices that emerged was centering student voice. So this is directly in line with some of our new practices that we're working to embed in our schools. For me, what I think it really comes down to is maintaining and keeping sight on your day-to-day actions and how those either send the message to your students that their voice matters or that, it might not. So I was thinking about an interaction I've observed in classrooms when a teacher's circulating and they notice that, a student has incorrectly utilized a foundational skill or a skill that's been taught prior to that day. How that teacher responds in that moment can either convey to them, I see you, I believe in you, and I want to know why this might have been challenging.
Yeah.
Or, it can also convey the opposite. And I think it's those little day-to-day interactions. It's not just this, now I need to go do empathy interviews every month. Right. It's a little bit of both. So it's that systematic, but it's also that just way of being in the classroom.
One of the reasons why I like this clip was that whole idea of centering student voice and what that looks like in the classroom. One of the things, since we've aired the episodes around that book of street data, that has been sticking in my mind is this, what makes this different is I see this as a reflection model for teachers, where it's requiring us to assess and monitor how we're doing based on how students are doing. It's a sort of meta-evaluative tool, I guess.
Yeah.
And so data collection, to me, at this level, is at a very intimate level. So you're making judgments. It's more than just looking and saying, okay, 5 students put up their hands or 10 students put up their hands.
Right.
This is more about, I am now thinking about how did my practice impact learning based on how they are interpreting it. And then trying to figure out from that one, what do we need to do to collect that information to truly make it student-centered? I'm seeing that word student-centered in a very different way since we've done that episode.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it feels only natural that if we're talking about student-centered, then we should center the student voice. Sometimes we say student-centered without actually bringing students into that process.
Yes. And so, for me, we've kind of talked about this in our department, is our student survey the way to center student voice, right? So what are ways to center student voice that we haven't taken advantage of in the past, and what do we need to do to keep lifting that up?
And it did strike me as we were planning this season just how much there was to unpack with that street data. Like a peek behind the curtain for listeners, when we were planning this season, we're like, we'll do an episode on street data. Yeah. And then we start researching. We're like, make it 2, make it 3. And even still, I feel like we're just kind of scratching at the surface of what does it mean, and how do you collect street data?
Yeah. And one of the nice things I'm hearing more and more people talk about the book, right? So it's still sort of percolating in people's minds. It's spreading throughout. I spoke to a professor at UNC the other day, and he was even talking about, he's just like, yeah, I heard about this book called Street Data. I'm like, it's getting...
Did you plug our podcast?
Did
you get some listens? There we go.
Did,
okay, I'll check the metrics.
And so, it's getting out there. And I think the real essence of it is, again, trying to redefine student voice, because I think that's like a concept that we've sort of thrown around. Make sure you amplify student voice. But what does that really look like and mean? And again, this notion of, as a teacher, reflecting on my practice through student voice. So reflecting on how I'm doing based on how they're doing.
Yeah.
And not just doing in terms of performance, but expanding their doing to include not just performance, but their well-being, their engagement, all of those things.
Yeah. And that's not a new idea by any means in education. It's just kind of recentering it. But I believe your second clip is something that is somewhat new to education.
So the second one, because I think I've said this to you, the minute we heard about AI when was it? Like last year, maybe about a year and a half now.
It came quick, that first ChatGPT 3 or something, I think. Yeah.
Since that first started, I have really been curious about what it is. I am surprised at the speed at which it is moving and, sessions, people talking about it. And so the second clip that I liked was from our episode called Assessment in the Age of AI. So let's play that for our listeners.
I think historically as teachers, in trying to save time for teachers and to have cleaner data, often we default to what is measurable, not what is meaningful. And some of these new technologies are pushing us back to more meaningful conversations that are more messy to measure, but they are more meaningful in terms of impact on student performance and growth.
So with that clip, when Allison said we tend to default to what is measurable and not what is meaningful, that has stuck with me since, that really hit. Because, research tells us that students learn more when they're able to make meaning, right? There's lots of research about making meaning out of their learning. And yet with AI, it is now requiring us to think about, what does it mean to be meaningful? What is meaningful, not only learning, but what is meaningful assessment? Like, what would that look like?
Yeah, and that brings to mind our just recent episode on the history of standardized testing. Is there's always going to be this gravitational pull to what is easy to measure, as opposed to perhaps what is the most meaningful. And you have to strike a balance because, logistics matter.
Yeah, and it reminds us of when search engines like Google was coming across, and as teachers, we were all afraid that students would just Google the answer, and they would say, well, if they can Google the answer, it's not a good question. I think we're back at that point where instead of the answer is not just, well, maybe I need to have a secure browser to stop them from searching.
Yeah.
I think this is really causing us to no, we need to really stop and think, what is meaningful for our students and engage them in that work.
Yeah, and it's funny that you should bring up Google, because just in the last week, as of us recording this at least, they've restructured a lot of their hardware division to really kind of organize around their AI plan and how to respond to that. Because Google was a little bit... So I'll make sure I don't get sued if I say Google was behind. But, they were playing catch up a little bit too with some of this, OpenAI and some of those things. And it begs the question, just how should we in education restructure some of our systems so that we are responding, but at the same time, you don't want to break anything in the attempt to respond.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it as well. Yeah. But I do think, like I said, I'm anticipating some changes. It's just going to be interesting to see what those changes are going to look like.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me think of first clip I'd like to play, in that AI now, a lot of the stuff that we measure, a lot of the stuff that we assess in a standardized format now, AI can do better than humans.
Correct.
In this moment, never mind a decade plus when our students are kind of searching for jobs. So for me, that made me think of just, what will be the employable skills for our students and how do we measure those and measure them with validity and reliability, which made me consider our interview with Dr. Cizik, a psychometrician.
Right.
And let's listen to him talk about just what is it that a psychometrician does.
Okay.
I think the first thing I'd want to emphasize about what a psychometrician does is that it's really, I think of it as a service role. Someone would come to a psychometrician and say, we need information on X, whatever X is. And a psychometrician's job is to try and figure out how to get high quality information about whatever someone wants to get information on. So that could really range far and wide.
So yeah, I loved hearing from Dr. Cizik just all the thoughtful and thorough ways that they approach a lot of our standardized assessments to make sure that it says what it's supposed to say.
Correct.
And but typically, as far as I know, and I could be off here, but typically I think that psychometricians tend to work with a lot of like multiple choice in terms of the assessment methods. But if we're thinking about employable skills that are getting into some of the higher order thinking skills, some of the critical thinking, maybe like 4Cs, those kind of things, I'd love to learn more about what psychometricians are doing or could be doing with other assessment methods, with gathering evidence of student learning in ways that are going to perhaps be authentic to what they're going to need to do when they leave Wake County schools.
So that makes me wonder about, one of the things they say with AI is students will need to be able to sort of debunk it, like to tell when it's correct from when it's incorrect. But again, how do you measure that? Because the typical ways that we have for measuring, like you said, is with multiple choice or one answer kinds of questions. And that's going to be like a demonstration or something that you might need to measure those skills. So I think the skills that students are going to need moving forward, we're going to have to rethink the methods to measure those skills.
Yep.
Because AI does a lot of things efficiently. And so again, with scoring, a lot of the things that we do is because, okay, this method is really easy for scoring. With AI, what would that do? Can it score open-ended responses more quickly? And so is that now back on the table? I mean, it's really going to be interesting to see as we move forward. How can we incorporate AI when it comes to like grading practices, scoring practices? I think that's going to be some interesting work.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we assess different skills in response to the AI to make sure that our students are feature ready. But then we also might be able to use AI to better assess. So on each of those. Yeah. Woo. Okay.
All right. What was your next clip?
So the last clip for us as we're looking back before we look forward came from our live episode, which was fun, but also really anxiety inducing to do that live, by the way. But I really liked, we were asking some of the participants that were there at NC Ties, just what does data literacy mean to you? And there's some wonderful responses. But one that really stood out to me was Kelly, an AP in New Hanover County Schools. I was intrigued when she said this about how she thinks about data literacy.
For me, data literacy means understanding my school's data well enough to know if we are growing and becoming more proficient. It also means understanding the financial data of the school to make sure we are spending wisely, allotting funds wisely, and being creative with our funds to make the most out of educator and support positions.
That struck me as just something that I didn't really consider in terms of data literacy, thinking about that financial literacy aspect of it. Probably, and we talked about this at the time, but just because I, as a classroom teacher, this position, it's not something I'm not dealing with money too often. But, in Wake County, we have, like 20,000 employees?
Yes.
And a decent chunk of them are working with money, thinking about like our data bites, talking about our grants department, which was wonderful. It just got me thinking, what does financial literacy look like in education? Because, it's... I could be off here, but my understanding, a lot of other realms, financial literacy is a kind of money in, money out kind of equation. But in education, the goal is not money out. The goal is something else. The goal is, even going back to what we just talked about, just, how is that money impacting our students' development of the skills that they're going to need for their future. So that got me thinking about just when we're looking at data literacy in terms of money, what does that mean in education?
I think one of the things that I liked about her clip and her lifting up financial literacy is typically when we think of definitions for either data literacy or assessment literacy, we're thinking about it from a classroom teacher. And so it was nice to hear a definition that's coming from someone outside of the classroom. What literacy needs do they have?
Yeah.
And so that inspired me to kind of think we need to broaden or just consider other stakeholders as well when we are doing professional learning or resources for our school-based staff, to widen it to stakeholders that are not just in the classroom, but outside of the classroom.
Yeah, like that way, season 2 or so, we did that episode on how to talk about data.
Oh,
and
yeah.
there's that piece, students are the shared responsibility of everyone. And a lot of the people that are working more with money, that they have an input that can impact student learning. We just need to make sure that we're bringing the right people to the table when we're having certain conversations.
So we've talked about the past episodes in this season. And as we look forward to season 5, what are some things that you want to explore?
Yeah, so for me, like what I mentioned before, I think AI, there was always a need to really focus on the 4 C's, but I think AI perhaps to me accelerated that a little bit.
Yeah.
So I do want to think a little bit more, and maybe you and I can research and report on it. Just what does it mean to provide systematic feedback on the 4 C's for students and collect data for us on the 4 C's? Because I think that's going to only be more important. Yeah. What about you?
So again, thinking of AI,
Yep.
I have been intrigued by how to use AI in data analysis, right? A lot of the work that we do is around analyzing data. And is there a place for AI in the work that we do? So I'm curious as to how can we use AI to support our work, to make our work easier? I think that's, when Allison talked about us, the role of AI, it is not, I think a lot of folks right now are thinking it's going to replace, but I want to see how can it make us better in the work that we do. So how can we use AI in the areas of analysis to make our work better, not to replace what we do, but to make our work more impactful, I guess.
Yeah, at times it makes me think of like autonomous driving,
Yep.
where people had these visions of like, you don't need the human at all. And maybe that'll be the case in the future, but it seems clear that some of these cars can maybe do some degree, but you still need someone there in the driver's seat with their hands near the steering wheel so that they can check and be like, I need to jump in now.
Right.
And same thing with perhaps AI with some of this data analysis. Just what can we offload so that we're not quite as worn down behind the wheel of the data literacy? This metaphor is kind of falling apart a little bit, while at the same time being close enough so that we can grab the wheel when needed.
Right. Another thing that I have been curious about is in a district this size, there's a lot of folks that are doing research to find out more about student learning or teaching. And so I'd love to know, how can we bring that information to our listeners? So stay tuned to hear more about that. We have been exploring some ideas, and I think you all are going to really appreciate hearing from, again, there's some other people who were doing interesting work around research and data when it comes to teaching and learning. So I'm excited for that work as well.
Yeah, same.
All right. So again, thank you all for your support. I think we've been growing our listenership, if that's a word. We've been growing our listenership in the last 4 years. And we are looking forward to our 5th season. We want to thank Rolesville Middle School's Jamaal Wellman for his theme music that we've used this season. And again, if there are any students who would like to send us music for us to use in next year's season, you can do so by emailing us at datalit@wcpss.net, or you can check out our website, www.wcpss.net/datalit. So until next time, when we do season 5, bye.
See you next season.